This is session 4, Tracking the Way Down. And we've been laying a foundation in this first part of Quieting Noisy Soul. And the first part is also called the we'll be looking at in this session and the next. And I want to give you an overview of some of these concepts that we'll be developing in a much greater degree in the sessions coming up. I call this the way down because Romans 1 shows the way down and how our unbelief disintegrates to many, many other problems. And as I mentioned in the last session, this way down is always predictable and it's always preventable. And that ought to give us a lot of hope. It ought to give us a lot of help as we are working with other people and as we're diagnosing what's going on in our own lives. And it ought to give us a lot of hope because there is a way out that we're going to look at in part 3 and a way back to the Lord in part 2. If you notice, the chart looks like a baseball diamond with a box also for center field. But it begins with the unbelief that we've been talking about in the last couple of sessions. And I want to reiterate Romans 1:21 for us again. When they knew God, now of course it's talking about the unbelieving world, but it's also talking about the propensity of every one of our hearts. When they knew God, they glorified Him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their own imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. And that's where our problems will begin too. That we know something to be true about God, but we reject it for some other fantasy. In our vain imaginations, we come up with some idea of God that isn't true of God. And then we try to live in that world with an idea of God that isn't true, and we wonder why we're having so many difficulties. And it begins with unbelief, and I call that the great disorder of the heart. Unbelief is a disorder because it accepts the reasoning of fallen man, and that is our imaginations, over the revelation of God. So here's God who says, this is what I'm like. And we say, He says, I love you always. And we say, but He doesn't love me. Or He doesn't love me today. And what we have done is taken what He says to be true and exalted our view of that above His. That is being disorderly. We have things in the wrong order. We've exalted our imaginations over the truth of what God is really like. And we're doing exactly the same thing that the world, the unsaved world does in Romans 1:23. We exchange the truth of God for a lie. God addresses this through the prophet Isaiah in Isaiah 55, verses 7 to 9. And God is speaking to His people. And listen to what He says. Let the wicked forsake his way. Now, He's not just talking about an unbelieving world out there. He's addressing His own people. He said, let the wicked, the ones who are exalting their own way and their own thoughts above mine, let the wicked forsake his way, and the unrighteous man his thoughts, and let him return unto the Lord, for He will have mercy upon him, and to our God, for He will abundantly pardon. And then He says, for my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are my ways your ways. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. And God says, it is wicked for you to exalt your thoughts above my thoughts. And it is wicked for you to exalt your ways above my ways, and let the wicked forsake his ways, and the unrighteous man his thoughts, and let him return unto the Lord, and He will have mercy upon him. And again, would you please notice the disposition of our God to us? He says, if you will come to me, let the wicked forsake his way, and He will abundantly pardon. This is the disposition of our God. He wants us back in fellowship with Him. So we have to ask ourselves some things in reality. Is it really true that God has spoken? Is it really true that He cares about us? Does He care about us? Will He do what He says He will do? Is sin really as bad as He says it is? Is holiness as important as He says it is? Will I really reap what I sow? Now, folks, our answers to those questions will have everything to do with the disintegration or the stability of our lives. Remember, rejecting anything that is true about God is called unbelief. And here's something interesting about unbelief. Unbelief isn't as easily recognizable as other sins. It kind of lurks in the shadows of our mind. It's easier to notice in our minds the lies, that we lied to somebody, or that we cheated in some way. I mean, those things are easy, or that we swore, we took the Lord's name in vain, or that we punched our brother's lights out, with our fist. I mean, those sins are easy to recognize, and it's not as easy to recognize the sins that are in the shadows of our heart, like unbelief. And so we have to take some time examining truth and let God Himself show us the unbelief of our heart. And in fact, so blinded are we by our unbelief that we think something else is our problem. We think our panic attack is our problem, or our anxiety is our problem, or our depression is our problem, or our anger is our problem. And certainly all of those are problems, but they're external problems that come from unbelief that is hiding in the heart, that has to be exposed and dealt with before we can deal with those issues. And God will show us the issues of unbelief when we're exposing ourselves to truth. And as we're going to see in the sessions toward the end of this seminar, that most of the psychiatric disorders of our day are rooted in this great disorder. And it is accurate that they call them disorders, because things are out of order. And the main thing that is out of order is what a person believes is true about God. And by the way, it should be no surprise to us, since this generation, this culture around us, is rejecting God. It should be no surprise to us that these so-called psychological disorders are growing in number, because God promised that man would disintegrate when they exchanged the truth of God for a lie. He promised it would be that way. This should not surprise us. It ought to grieve us, but it should not surprise us. And the unbelieving world is increasingly rejecting the truth of God, and the believing world is increasingly forgetting the truth about God. And we have many of the same problems the world has for the same reason the world has them. And again, it shouldn't surprise us, but it should grieve us. We're going to look real briefly at some situations in the Scriptures, but I want us to see that these passages are merely representative of many that show this relationship in the Scriptures between unbelief and whatever problem is on the surface. And in each of these passages, a more obvious sin shows up, but God's rebuke is for unbelief. Now, and I don't want us to miss this, because we can be saying, well, Berg, you just made all that up. You want to make that unbelief is a problem, and you try to short this down. I'm not making this up. This is God who thought this up. Now, He didn't give it to us in a chart. I will admit that. But the flow of God's thinking is the same. For example, in Numbers chapter 20, that's where Moses struck the rock. It's the lengthiest passage of Scripture dealing with anger. We're going to look at that passage in great detail when we discuss anger later on. But Moses struck that rock in anger, and I think it's very telling that God did not scorch Moses for anger. He didn't say, Moses, there you go, blow on your fuse again. I mean, you did that killing Egyptians back there 40 years ago, 80 years ago. And now here you are doing that again. He didn't fuss at Moses for his anger. He said, you and Aaron will not go into the promised land because you believed me not to sanctify me before the eyes of the children of Israel. What is he saying? Moses, you saw something else as the real problem with these people, and what you didn't see is what I'm seeing as a problem with these people, and what I'm seeing is a problem with you, and it's unbelief. Now, I didn't make that connection. God made that connection. It's Him that said Moses' problem was unbelief. When we look at that and say, that's an angry man, God says it's an unbelieving man. I don't mean that Moses was an unbeliever in the sense he was a pagan, but he was not believing what is true about God. Jesus puts the disciples out in a boat, shakes it up real good, and they get real fearful. He's asleep in the boat, and they wake him up, and they say what? Carest thou not that we perish? Don't you care about us? And what does he say? How is it that you are so fearful? How is it that you have no faith? In essence, he's saying, how is it you are unbelieving? Of course I care for you. So here we have people, we say, boy, well, of course they are afraid. You know what Jesus said? You're unbelieving. Now, folks, I didn't make that connection. Jesus made that connection. He is describing for us the way down. Our fear is rooted in unbelief. Our anger is rooted in unbelief. In Hebrews chapter 12, he says, let us run with endurance this race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set down before him endured the cross, despising the shame, for consider him, lest you be wearied and faint in your minds. Where does a fainting, discouraged, despairing mind come from? A mind that does not have Jesus Christ as its focus. Now, I didn't make that connection. Jesus made that connection. God made that connection in his word. And we could go to passage after passage after passage, which looks like people have emotional problems, or it's just their anxiety or their fear or the despair, or they have a fainting mind, or they're discouraged. And always it's going to be brought, always the solution is there's something about God that's not in the picture right now in your thinking. It's unbelief. I had a physician ask me one time about somebody who was very, very anxious and nervous and many, many problems. And the physician said, you don't think she has spiritual problems, do you? Folks, all of us have spiritual problems. Of course she has spiritual problems. I have spiritual problems. And in our pride, we like to think, well, you don't think I have spiritual problems, do I? Until I'm like Jesus, I have a spiritual problem. And until I think like God all the time, I have a spiritual problem. Let's not run away from this idea that we have spiritual problems. Of course we have spiritual problems. We need to know more about God. And until we're like him and see him as he is, we all have a spiritual problem yet. Now, we're growing, but let's not say, well, you don't think he has a spiritual problem, do you? Yes, and I do too. And you do too if you think you don't have a spiritual problem. Because we all do. And we need to be humble enough to admit it, that is where our problems are coming from. Number 3 here, the lie, the fantasy, the great disorder is that God is not doing enough for me. God himself is not enough for me. I need something more. And that's the little phrase that's in the box under unbelief. The lie of unbelief is that God is not doing enough for me. God himself is not enough for me. I need something more. Now, folks, that is a fantasy. I don't need anything more today, and you don't need anything more today. God is more than enough. But that may not mean anything to us if we don't know God well. I'm not saying we don't know God at all, but if we don't know him well. For example, we say, well, how can that be? That you think all we need is God. Well, I remember when I was first married, and some of you remember when you were first married. And if people have said, well, how do you expect to get married? I mean, you only have $25 between the two of you. How are you going to pay the rent? How are you going to do that? And we think, well, we just need each other. We don't have to have any furniture. We'll sit on boxes. And we don't have to have any food. I mean, we can eat macaroni and cheese every night for, 6 months, and a lot of us did, We don't need anything else. We just have each other. What are we saying? And compared to everything else, all I need is that person. If you understand what I'm saying in that relationship, extrapolate that about 1 million times more or more, and understand that's all. I really do just need Jesus. I really don't need anything else. And as Job found out, you can take away your health, you can take away everybody that loves you and cares about you, rip away all your possessions, and you can say, though he slay me, yet will I trust him. I don't need anybody else. I don't need anything else. I don't even need my health. But I do need God. Now, you won't be saying that unless you know who we're talking about. I mean, if you have a real warped view of him, we might have said that about our fiancé. We wouldn't have said that about every other girl in the world. You don't just randomly pick and say, well, all I need is her. We don't know a thing about her. You only say that about something that you know a lot about, and you know that person's disposition toward you, and you know your disposition toward her, and you can say, all I need is that girl. When, really the truth is, I really don't even need her either. I need God. But we know what we're saying in that. And I'm not discounting my wife either when I say that. She's a wonderful person. And both of us have had to come to grips with surgeries each of us have faced, that there might be a time in our life that we have passed, and it will come eventually, when we don't have the other person. And we've had to face the fact that we might not have the other person now. And you know what, folks? God was enough then, too. And He'll be enough when it does happen. We don't need anything else. We just need God. So this idea that God is not doing enough for me, and God Himself is not enough for me, I need something more, is a lie. And it's the lie of unbelief, because it shows I do not know God well enough. If we reject what God says to be true, all we can do is live in a fantasy world of imagination, because the world, as we are choosing to believe it, does not exist. Now again, follow along with me as I develop the logic here. It's very important for us to understand. Folks, a world where God does not love does not exist. There isn't a world like that where God does not love all of us. That world doesn't exist. If you think that world exists, you're living in a fantasy world. A world where God is not in control of all things does not exist. That world doesn't exist. If you think that there's some things that are going on that God isn't running and God isn't taking care of and God isn't handling right, you're living in a fantasy world, because that world doesn't exist. A world where God is not with me and does not hear my cry does not exist. He always hears our cry. And He is touched with the feelings of our infirmities. You say, how do you know that? He said it. A world where God is heavy-handed and mean-spirited does not exist. I cannot tell you how many people have told me my view of God, as we heard from the testimony of Liz. I felt God was heavy-handed. She said in a later time, I felt like one wrong move and He's going to bust me. Did you know the world with a God like that doesn't exist? And if you're trying to live in a world where you think that is the way God is, you're living in a fantasy world. And it can only bring your own disintegration, because that kind of a world does not exist. As an example, Philippians 4:19 describes the real world. But my God shall supply all your need according to His riches in glory by Christ Jesus. That's the real world. Now, I get a little weary of these people who say, well, if you send your kid away to a Christian school, how's it going to exist in the real world? The folks out there don't understand the real world. They're living in a fantasy, folks. If our kids in Christian schools are learning well and we're teaching well, they probably are the only ones on the planet who understand the real world. The real world is that God does exist. And the real world is that our God has spoken. And the real world is that what our God says matters. Any other kind of world that people try to live in is a fantasy world. And you and I can easily live in a fantasy world by deception if we don't believe the truth. Now, let's go back to Philippians 4:19. But my God shall supply all your need according to His riches and glory by Christ Jesus. You know what that means? That God will always meet my genuine needs, always. I will always have what I need. You say, well, you think I needed that flat tire on the way to church in that rainstorm? Do you think I needed that? Yes, I do. You say, well, how do you know that? Because that's what you got. And He said, I promise to give you everything you need. So what you and I have, folks, is what we need. And you say, well, I don't need this. How's this supposed to help me? I don't need that. I don't need another this, and I don't need another that. How's that supposed to help me? Oh, no, it will. Well, how do you know that? Because that's what you have. And He promised, my God shall supply all your need according to His riches and glory by Christ Jesus. And folks, that means that whatever you and I have, we need it. And a loving, wise, caring, powerful God made sure we got it. Why? Because we needed it. So I don't see the good in it. Well, you will in what he's doing in you through it, as we look at God is more than enough in a few sessions from now. But that leads us to the second box. That unbelief, out in center field there on the chart, always leads to discontent. And please understand this. You can't be anxious, as we're going a little bit later. You can't be worried about something you don't think you have to have. And I'm not just talking about tricking our minds about something. I mean, if you are thoroughly content, you won't be nervous that you don't have it. If you are thoroughly content, you won't be angry that you don't have it. If you are thoroughly content, you won't be depressed because you don't have it. Discontent drives every one of those other things, and discontent is rooted in our unbelief. Because we've already decided I need something more, and I just recognize I don't have it, and now I'm discontent. Discontent is the dissatisfaction of not having what we have decided we need. And the whining of our discontent in our heart is familiar. It comes out in several ways we think. Now, remember I said in the first session, if you want to deal with the noise in your soul, you have to begin tracking your thoughts. And we're going to get more and more specific as we go along about our thoughts. And here's one way we track our thoughts about discontent. And you see the little box under discontent. If only I had what I need, or I should be, or I should have something, or I don't like. Anytime you preface any of your thoughts with those statements, those are statements of discontent. And I exhort you to start a spiritual notebook, a spiritual journal, whatever you want to call it, a Christian growth notebook or whatever, and put one page just of if-onlys. And as God begins helping you track your thoughts, write down what you were saying, if only I had this. If only my spouse would try to understand me. If only my boss would understand me. If only my parents would understand me. See, those are statements of discontent. If only people appreciated me more. If only I had more freedom. If only I had more money. If only I had more say. If only I had better health. If only I had less pain. If only I had fewer doctor bills. If only I had more answers about what's going on in my life. If only I hadn't messed up. If only I hadn't been abused. If only I hadn't gotten drunk. If only I had grown up with different parents. If only I had different brothers or sisters. If only I weren't married. If only I were single again. If only I were married to somebody who loves me. If only I had finished college. If only I had answered the call to preach. If only I had not run away and gotten in trouble. All of these imply that something would give me satisfaction if it had been different. Track your if-onlys, folks. They reveal the discontent of our hearts. Say, well, some of those things shouldn't have happened. I shouldn't have been abused, and I shouldn't have run away. That's true. But with a God as powerful as ours, and as forgiving as ours, and as loving as ours, He didn't need anything else to make us different. He didn't need a perfect past to make us different now. We have what we need now. And we may have some regrets about the past. We may have some shame about the past. But did you know that our past does not interfere with God's ability to use us now if we are in fellowship with Him? That's a wonderful thing. Discontent is also full of, I should be or I should have. By now, I should be rich. I remember a statement my grandfather used to say when he was irritated with some of the neighbors. It wasn't a particularly spiritual thing to say, but he'd say, if you're so smart, how come you ain't rich? By now, I should be more rich. By now, I should be married. By now, I should be through with college. By now, I should be successful. By now, I should have a higher paying job. By now, I should have a family that respects me. By now, I should have a decent home. Well, maybe all of those things would be nicer in one way or another, but those are all statements of discontent. They're saying, I don't have what I need right now. God is not doing enough for me, and God himself is not enough for me. I need something more. And that's a lie. And it comes out in our if-only statements, in our should-be statements, in our should-have statements. And discontent is full of I don't like statements. I don't like my circumstances. I don't like the food. By the way, when we talk about discontent, God takes griping personally. Why? Because he's the one who's given us everything we have. If you don't believe that, look at Numbers 11 and see what he thought of the children of Israel when they fussed about the menu. Manna. And he dealt with them for their discontent, and he called it unbelief. I don't like my circumstances. I don't like my job. I don't like my spouse. I don't like my standard of living. I don't like having to depend upon other people for help. I want to be able to do this myself. I don't like it that my body won't let me work like it used to work. I don't like having to work so hard when life is easier for other people. I don't like having to work so hard to overcome my past when other people didn't have it that rough. I don't like it when I work hard and nobody seems to notice much. None of those things are pleasant. But when we feed our minds with I don't like statements like that, we're feeding the discontent, and we're saying God is not enough for me, and God is not doing enough for me. I need something more. And folks, we don't need anything more. These are dangerous because, as you see in the box under discontent on third base, a lust for more is the basis for every temptation in the heart. Did you know that you can't be tempted with something you don't want? I drive up to North Carolina, a lot of times going up to the Wilds Christian camp up there. And that's up in the mountains. And every once in a while, I'll run across a possum that's been run over, or a raccoon that's been run over. Did you know that I've never been tempted by roadkill? I really haven't. You know, I don't say, honey, we got to stop. I mean, this is great grilling meat right here. This has never been a temptation, folks. You can't tempt me with roadkill. Why? Because I don't want it, and I don't think any of you want it either. Did you know that you can't be tempted with anything unless you want it real bad? How many little boys are tempted to sneak behind the barn with Bilo bags full of broccoli? You know? Hey, come on with me. Let's go back behind the barn. I got a whole bag of broccoli. We won't tell anybody else. You know, how many times does that happen? You can't tempt little boys with broccoli. Can't tempt a lot of adults with broccoli. Do you see the point? This is why James says in James 1:14, every man is tempted when he's drawn away of his own lusts, his strong desires, the things he thinks he has to have. And once you are discontent about something, you are a sitting duck for temptation. You can't be tempted with something you don't want. If God is enough for you, and God is doing enough for you, and you don't need anything more, you can't be tempted with anything. This is at the heart of the murmuring of the children of Israel. If you would look in Numbers 11 to 16 sometime, don't take the time to do it right now, but if you'll take Numbers 11 to 16, you'll see how many times the people of Israel are murmuring. And here's what they're saying. I'm rephrasing this in phrases we would recognize, but they're saying, if only life were easier in this wilderness. In fact, that's the first time they really got upset with Moses. They said, this is too hard for us. What are they saying? If only life were easier in the wilderness. If only we had water in the wilderness. If only we had something else besides this stupid manna. You say, they say stupid manna? Yeah, it's right in the Hebrew. Check it out. They just didn't like it. If only we had more say. They're discontent, and they say, Moses, you take too much on yourself. The rest of us are people of Israel too. Remember when they said that? Well, I put my pants on just like my boss puts his pants. Who's he to tell me what to do? I wish I had more say. If only I had more say, it wouldn't be like this. You know what that is? That's discontent. If only I had more say. If only we were back in Egypt. And then get this one. If only we were dead. Say, did they say that? Yeah, they did. fact, they said that in Numbers 20 with Moses too, later on. They said, would to God we had died with our brothers in the wilderness. They said, boy, you know what? Our brethren got off easy. They died. We got to follow you. We'd rather be dead than follow you. If only we were dead. You know what? All of those are statements of discontent. And all of them are rooted in unbelief. That God is not doing enough for me. And that God himself is not enough for me. I have to have something more. Now, folks, of all people, we have this Scripture. We have his Spirit in us. We have the truth. Of all people, we ought to be the most stable, the most joyful, the most peaceful people because we have a God who has said true things. And if we will reject the lies and hang on to the truth, we will become stable if we're not now. And I want us to see that the process of the way down moves from unbelief. We have rejected what is true about God to discontent. We need to examine our hearts. Lord, show me where I'm discontent, where I'm thinking I have to have something more. If only I had this. I should have this by now. So-and-so should have done this for me by this time. I don't like this that is happening, and I don't like that is happening. And some of those things are legitimate things. I don't like it that my children are rebelling, or I don't like it that my spouse doesn't love me. And those are legitimate things. What do you do with legitimate concerns? You take it to the Lord. The God who has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. I will hear you. I am the same yesterday, today, and forever. I am a God you can count on. And I encourage you, begin a list of your own if-onlys and I shoulds and I don't likes. If I could say it this way, these are the pre-cancer cells in the soul. They lead to the full-blown problems. If you can track in your mind the if-onlys, and I should have, and I should be, and I don't like, and if you can begin tracing those in your heart, you will find the pre-cancer cells that will keep, if you eliminate those with the right beliefs about God, we're going to talk about in future sessions, it will save you from your own disintegration. Learn to look for the roots of unbelief and discontent when you see the fruit of guilt and anxiety, anger, and despair. Look for the unbelief and for the discontent. They are the start in the way down.